When I started to think about museum realisms in relation to the Africa Museum, which I guess needs a little bit of explanation because I know about the Africa Museum because I did my PhD on a group of Dutch Catholic missionaries who set the museum up in 1945. So that's my connection there. And in fact, the father who got the assignment to start the museum was one who worked in the area about which I wrote my dissertation. He got initiated in a native rank just to make things a little bit more juicy in that respect. There's a lot more about that, I can't go into that, but when I started thinking about museum realisms in relation to this, to the Africa Museum, and of course rereading some of your work, I couldn't but be reminded of this wonderful short essay on Michel Leiris that you put in The Predicament of Culture, which is actually a sort of a review, you could say, of Michel Leiris's L'Afrique fantôme. In a way, is his attempt to tell a story about his participation in the Dakar-Djibouti expedition in the 1950s, together with Marcel Griol, but in a way that is relentlessly self-critical, that is never about just telling it the way it is, not in the sense of telling the Africa that he is encountering on the way, but also not even in the sense of telling what he really experienced. Both those activities of trying to be objective on the one hand, or trying to be confessional on the other, right? Telling the true story about himself. Neither of those work. Jim brings out wonderfully how Leiris tries to negotiate those tensions. And what it actually tells us is that at that time, in any case, the different realisms are being juxtaposed in the simple act of trying to tell a story about a scientific expedition. That multiplicity is something I would like to underscore, especially because it also made me recognize something that I worked on earlier in a very different context. This is a photo of Alfred Russel Wallace, the anthropologist explorer, together with the ghost of his mother. It was photographed by Frederick Hudson under the influence of the medium, the spiritual medium, Mrs. Guppy. Together they managed to make some of the memories of the people they worked with in seances come true, make them real in a way. Hudson obviously did this by something that we now can identify as double exposure. But interestingly enough, that double exposure is clearly something that for some people in this situation at least was real. For others who sold it, it's a slightly more difficult question to realize what exactly they meant with it. The interesting thing about these kind of products, I feel, is that, and that's going to be the topic of my reflections on the Africa Museum, this kind of modern magic, because clearly photography is modern magic, right? Whether it's spirit photography or not. This kind of modern magic always had this double side to it, this sense that there is not just one reality, but at least two that we need to consider and unravel. And I think Jim has just told us a lot about how positive that can be, that sense of not looking at just one thing, but having to consider that complexity. In fact, I would argue that one of the redeeming factors of the exotic might be that the exotic is far more complex than the critical tendencies that we cultivated in the 1990s tended to bring out. So it might be an interesting question to try and find some of that complexity back in what we suspected as predominantly colonial, denigrating, etc., and to try to look for those things. One of the things that also strikes me about the magical side of the exhibitionary complex is the strange paradox that exhibitions usually, very often, work with stuff that can make anything. In this case, this is the Columbian exhibition in Chicago in 1993, it is plaster. Plaster was used to recreate the Paris of the Belle Epoque, which was, according to the Chicago exhibition masters at the time, with the possible exception of Louis Sullivan, the exhibition masters thought that that was the epitome of art and culture, and therefore it had to be replicated in its entirety. And if you realize how enormously large these grounds were, how much plaster was needed to build all those buildings, you can get a sense of the extent of the magic that was being made there, even for a temporary exhibition, right? It was destroyed after the exhibition was held. So this paradox between generating something real but in a plastic medium is, I think, something that is always present in all forms of the exhibitionary complex. And that is something I took, well, this is a way to say, this not only works with the plaster buildings, but also even in the entertainment section, because the Midway Pleasance was the place where you could find most of the ethnographic exhibits. So that's it was in that sense related to these. Coming to the Africa Museum, I'd like to just read you the text of this early advertisement, as you can see, from Sunday the 27th of July 1958. When there was a cycling event in Groesbeek. The Africa Museum, who had just adopted this new logo by that time, draws an audience with the sentence, sorry, I need to look up the translation. A visit to the museum is like a sojourn among primitive peoples. You will see the fears and joys of primitive humanity. Idols, fetishes, sorcerers, rulers, dance, music, love, and vanity. Instructive and surprising for young and old, beauty and fear in the land of the sun. Especially, I think, the first sentence is clearly a magical sentence, right? This is not possible. In fact, people would continue on these lines with other advertisements by saying that Africa is not as far as you think, it lies close to Nijmegen. This is what I meant with magic and realism. There is, on the one hand, a realist claim, right? By visiting our museum, you will be in direct contact with idols, sorcerers, you name it, with, in fact, Africa. I used to think that this was a negative thing. I'm not so sure now that I've gone through the material about the Africa Museum, because there is, in these years at least, and this is where the being historical that Jim emphasizes is so important, I think at least in these years there is a good reason to look with a certain amount of respect to the way in which the missionaries who were still conducting the museum at that time were transforming themselves and their museum from something that emphasized clearly the work of conversion and a considerable amount of disrespect for indigenous African expressions of religion into something that was actually far more respectful, and certainly in the context of the still heavily developmentalist and heavily Christian cultures of the Netherlands at the time. At the same time, that required a certain magic. On the photograph on the left-hand side, you see two of the first buildings of the outdoor museum. At that point, of course, still simply called the Negerdorp, modestly translated as the African village, without trying to reproduce the denigrating terms that is used. It's the Cameroonian chief's house on the left-hand side that is still there, although maybe in a reconstructed form, I don't know. I still have to find that out. On the right-hand side, the far right-hand side, you see the remnants of the Morogoro hut. Some of the interesting things about this story is that in the advertisements themselves, the missionaries say, yes, this is something, they tell the visitors, you can bring your children too because we have a menagerie and we have an outdoor museum and they can run around there, right, while you are doing serious things inside. So there's this distinction between the magic is for the children and the realism is for the adults. But in fact, that same statement is followed immediately by the statement, these huts that we built are not only built with authentic materials, but we've made sure that an African expert is coming to build them. Right? So the emphasis is at the same time on the really real, the really authentic, the thing that works. The outdoor museum was opened by the bishop, who probably commissioned the chief's house to be built. I'm not sure. He was a Dutch bishop from Cameroon. And at the same time, a group of Boy Scouts dressed up like little Negroes. As they did in Catholic culture more regularly, which is the photo on the right. This is the Holy Child's Day, which every year was held on the instigation of the Vatican. It's a very sort of top-down tradition imposed. But one of the things is that children could dress up as little nuns, little priests, and little Negroes. And I still haven't got a decent answer to the question why those little Negroes were part of the ritual. I think that is, if we have a decent answer to that question, we might have a good answer to, not only how colonially inflected certain exoticisms are, but also why they attract people and how we might be able to reinvigorate some of the complexity that I feel the magic of realism, as I would like to call it, teaches us. How some of that complexity can be used to make new kinds of exhibitions in the near future. That's it.